Okay, now we're into performance. All right, this is part 4 of this lecture. First of all, we're going to touch on what the seller's obligation is. All right, now we've got a contract formed, and we talked, or we will actually, this is another part of common law that we haven't gotten to yet, but we will, is performance and breach. All right, what are the seller's and the buyer's obligations under the code? Well, let's talk about the seller first. First, they have an obligation to tender delivery. All right, what does that mean? Tender is an important concept, and it's something that you've probably heard of before. All right. What this means for the seller is that they have to put and hold conforming goods at the buyer's disposition and notify the buyer that he can take possession. So it's basically a show of compliance. You have asked that I build these things or manufacture these things, and I have, and now they are ready for you. All right. That's basically a tender of delivery. Say, I have done it and I am complying with this contract. All right. We will see when we get to the buyer's obligations the impact of that tender and what it does to the buyer's obligations, what they have to do in the contract. All right. The tender also has, and we'll talk about tender as it relates to the buyer's obligation. The tender has a bunch of different meanings. It has a bunch of different applications, but basically the same meaning. It means a willingness to perform, or the ability to perform. For example, take out any piece of American currency that you might have on you, not coin but paper, and it says on it, "This note is legal tender for all debts, public and private." What that means is that the government is telling anybody who's looking at that or who is considering taking that in exchange for goods and services or for any debt, and saying, if somebody's handing you this, they are showing you their willingness and ability to pay value for whatever it is that you've gotten. Now, there's a big argument over the fact that they had to put that in there because it used to say that our dollars were backed by gold, the gold reserve, and it's no longer backed by the value of gold. It's now just a legal tender. So if you want to read up more about that, read all about the Federal Reserve System and the gold standard. It's very, very interesting if you're into political economy and I don't know, the politics of money and credit. But we're not going to get into that here. But the idea is the same, right? The fact that your dollar bill or your $20 bill, your $100 bill is legal tender for all debts, public and private, is just another way of saying that when somebody hands you that, they have shown you their legal ability to pay value for whatever it is they owe you money for. Okay, so tender of delivery. Putting the goods at the buyer's disposition, knowing that he may take possession. Showing the buyer that I am complying, I have the ability to comply, and we are on schedule and on track. The effect of that tender is that it's going to trigger the buyer's duty to inspect and to pay. Again, we'll get to that in just a minute when we talk about the buyer's obligations. All right? So, let's talk about them. The buyer's obligations. First of all, they have to tender a payment, right? This shouldn't come as a surprise, even though the language and the vocabulary is a little weird. If you're selling something, your obligation is to give the person what you're selling. If you're buying something, your obligation is going to be to pay for it. All right? But the buyer's obligation is to tender payment. All right? Demonstrate a willingness to pay for conforming goods. Now, why are we talking about them tendering? Why don't we just have their obligation? Seller has to give them something, buyer has to pay for it. Because and we'll get to this when we talk about breach in common law, when a breach happens, when there's a breach of contract, it's only a full material breach if one party is unable or unwilling to perform and the other party is the exact opposite. They are able, they are willing, and they want to perform. So the way that you show that you are willing, able to perform is through a tender. Right? So the buyer may not always, let's come back to the Uniform Commercial Code, the buyer may not always have to pay. All right? The seller may not always have to deliver. Right? The buyer is not going to have to pay for goods that aren't conforming. They're not going to have to pay for goods that they haven't received. But if they haven't received goods, or if something else has happened and the seller may be in breach, the buyer is going to have to tender and say, hey, I am still willing to pay. I am still willing to complete performance on this contract that we have together. Right? So that's why we just stop at tender, not actually paying. That's your obligation. Okay, and obviously, you know, when you do have conforming goods, you're going to have to pay for them, but that brings us to the perfect tender rule. Right? This is a very important part of the code, and is a bit complicated, but not really. I think it makes a lot of sense. It's very common sense, as is most of the code. Okay, here's how this works. When the buyer gets delivery, right? Because remember, the seller's obligation is to tender delivery and say, here they are, come inspect them and pay for what's conforming, all right? So the buyer has the right to inspect the goods to make sure that they conform before he pays. He or she pays, sorry. And to do that within a reasonable time after delivery. So you can't sit on your hands and say, I got too many other important things to do, but at some point you got to get around to checking out those goods. Once the buyer has inspected the goods, he or she has some options. First of all, you can take a look at them and say, yep, this is exactly what I wanted. They're all conforming. Or you go the other way and say, this is completely wrong. They're not conforming to what I asked for. They're not conforming to this contract, to our agreement, or whatever, and say I rejected them all. Or you can accept some and reject some other ones. All right, so you have options there as a buyer. All right. The idea behind that is they have to provide a, quote, perfect tender, right? And if they have not provided all conforming goods, it's not a perfect tender. If there is something in there that's non-conforming, the buyer does not have an obligation to accept them and pay for them, right? But we need to understand what the dynamics are of rejecting goods and accepting goods, and talk about how that works, how it's done, and what it means. So let's get into that. First of all, rejection. When a buyer rejects goods as non-conforming, the first thing you got to do is tell the seller. It says that you must seasonably notify seller. I have no idea what seasonably means. I don't know. If you have to do it with seasonings like parsley or something, I don't know. But you have to do it within a reasonable time, and I think we've dealt with the word reasonable enough so that we understand what that means. All right. So let the seller know that there's something wrong with some or all of the goods. All right. Acceptance. Now this is a little more complicated. Acceptance can be done a bunch of different ways. First of all, if the buyer flat out says, yeah, these are good, they're satisfactory, that's the most obvious, an express acceptance, indicating that they conform or they're satisfactory. Second, all right, the buyer's inspected, and this time he's just not made a rejection, right? 2602 is the section above that deals with rejection. Rejection has to be done seasonably, whatever that means, and within a reasonable time. If it's not in a reasonable time, it's not a proper, not only is it not a proper rejection, but it's an acceptance. So if you wait too long and you sit on your hands, it counts as accepting those goods. All right? Or number three, if the buyer takes action inconsistent with seller's ownership of the goods. So here's what that means. Let's say you're Bath Iron Works, you're getting a shipment of steel, and the shipment comes in. You don't say boo to the supplier, but you start using the steel to build a boat. Well, if you were planning on returning them back to the seller, you wouldn't be attaching them with rivets to your boat that you're trying to build. So you don't have to say a word. Your actions will indicate your acceptance. So this is sort of the implied acceptance by your conduct. Your conduct with those goods can indicate that you accept them and that you have no intention of returning them back to the seller. Okay, so what happens when goods are accepted? All right, you've done one of those three things. You've either told them, or you've acted in a way that's inconsistent with rejecting it, or you've just botched the rejection to the point where you couldn't possibly try to reject them now because it's either too late or something else has gone wrong. First of all, well, now you got to pay, right? Your obligation as a buyer is to tender payment. But you still have, even after you've tendered payment, you still have the right to inspect. The perfect tender rule is still in play, and you don't have the obligation to actually pay the agreed upon contract price until you've accepted those goods. Now remember, you can accept some and reject others. So when you do accept some, that triggers your obligation to pay the contract price for the ones you have accepted. All right? What about rejected? All right, when goods are rejected, first of all, the buyer has to return the rejected goods back to the seller, but we're not going to go there, and there's a lot of rules on what happens and how that happens. I just don't want to go there. When goods are rejected, the seller has a right to cure whatever was wrong, whatever was non-conforming, all right, before the buyer can sue for damages. So we're protecting these parties from litigation. The Uniform Commercial Code is written in a way that it tries to make litigation over these issues the absolute last resort, and it does it in a very intelligent way. So before a buyer can sue for damages, the seller has a right to cure. Two ways this happens. Number one, if the time for performance hasn't expired yet, the seller can actually say, oh, okay, I know I only sent you 100 shirts, there's 50 more coming, and since the contract says you didn't need them until March 1st, they'll be there by then. Right? So the buyer is right to complain or reject the delivery if there's 50 fewer shirts than LL Bean ordered. However, if the time for performance isn't expired yet, the seller can say, okay, look, yeah, I'm going to fix that because we just don't have the other 50, but we're making them now, and they'll be done in a week, and we'll get them to you right away within the time that the contract gave us to perform. That just makes sense. Second, if the time is expired, the seller's going to have some time to cure only if they had a reasonable belief that it would be acceptable. I probably should have underlined or bold-faced this. The seller has to have a reasonable belief that they would have been acceptable. Go back to the t-shirt scenario. If the t-shirt manufacturer is sending 100 less t-shirts than LL Bean ordered, and it's on the last day available for performance, well, that's not going to be acceptable. You don't have a reasonable belief that LL Bean is going to take half of what they ordered. No, I put 2 A's here. It's my first typo on this thing. That second A should be gone. Anyway, so if the time is expired, the seller had a reasonable belief they would have been acceptable, then they also have a reasonable time to cure, and they've got to notify the buyer that they're going to. So that can give them some extra time to perform in accordance with the contract. But they have to have a reasonable belief that it would have been acceptable. And there's also some good faith here. You can't just lie by saying, oh, I thought that's what you wanted, because you're trying to buy some time and not get sued for not being able to provide the goods that they did order. That's where good faith comes into play, being honest in fact and in accordance with fair standards of dealing in the industry and all that stuff. Okay, so seller's right to cure. Fun stuff. All right, part 5 of this lecture, moving